3 engagement rings, 4 broken hearts, and 1 sociopath who almost destroyed us all. This is how I uncovered the most elaborate deception. I thought I knew everything about the man I was going to marry in 6 weeks. We'd been together for 2 years, engaged for 8 months, and I genuinely believed I was living in a fairy tale. He was charming, successful, and seemed to adore me. Every morning he'd bring me coffee in bed. Every evening he'd ask about my day with such genuine interest that I felt like the luckiest woman alive. We had our wedding venue booked, invitations sent, and my dress hanging in the closet like a symbol of everything perfect about our future together. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when I was running errands downtown. I'd finished getting my nails done for our engagement photos and decided to surprise him at his office with lunch from his favorite deli. As I walked toward the building, I saw him coming out of the coffee shop across the street. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, and she was wearing what looked exactly like my engagement ring. My heart started racing as I watched them from behind a parked car. The way he touched her arm, the way she leaned into him, the intimate way they walked together, it all felt wrong. When she turned to kiss him goodbye, I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested she had no idea she was part of something terrible. As she walked away, I noticed she kept touching her ring finger, the same unconscious habit I'd developed since getting engaged. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to process what I just witnessed. Maybe she was his sister, maybe a cousin, maybe someone who just happened to have a similar ring. I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but the sick feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. When I finally worked up the courage to approach him, he was already gone. That evening, I tried to act normal when he came home. I made his favorite dinner, we watched our show, and I waited for him to mention running into someone or having an unusual day. He didn't. Instead, he spent the entire evening being extra affectionate, complimenting my cooking, and talking excitedly about our honeymoon plans. The contrast between his behavior and what I'd witnessed made me feel like I was losing my mind. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with finding out more about the woman I'd seen. I started paying attention to his phone habits, his schedule, and any changes in his routine. He'd always been somewhat private about his phone, claiming he just didn't like people reading over his shoulder, but now I noticed he took it with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. When it rang, he'd often step outside to answer it, saying it was work-related. The breaking point came when I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. It was from an expensive jewelry store downtown, dated 3 weeks before he proposed to me. The amount was exactly what my engagement ring had cost, which I knew because I'd overheard him talking to his friend about it. But the receipt showed a purchase for 2 rings, not 1. My hands were shaking as I stared at that piece of paper, trying to come up with any explanation other than the obvious one. I decided to go to the jewelry store myself. I told the salesperson I was his fiancé and that I was curious about the matching wedding bands we'd discussed. The woman behind the counter looked confused and asked me to clarify which fiancé I was. The world seemed to tilt sideways as she explained that my fiancé had been in several times over the past year, each time with a different woman, each time purchasing engagement rings. She showed me the records, 4 separate transactions, 4 different rings, all within the span of 18 months. The dates told a story that made my stomach turn. He'd bought the first ring 14 months ago, the second one 12 months ago, mine 8 months ago, and the most recent one just 2 months ago. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was engaged to multiple women simultaneously. I left the jewelry store in a daze and sat in my car for an hour, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, but a bigger part of me needed to know the full extent of his deception. I needed to understand how deep this went and how many other women were living the same lie I was. Update 1. I spent the next week becoming a detective in my own life, and what I discovered was worse than I could have imagined. Using the information from the jewelry store and some careful social media searching, I managed to identify 2 of the other women. The third one took longer to find, but eventually I pieced together enough clues to locate all of them. The first woman I found was a teacher who lived about an hour north of our city. Her social media was full of pictures with him, engagement photos that looked almost identical to ours, and posts about planning her wedding for next spring. She talked about her fiancé with the same adoration I'd felt, shared the same inside jokes, and even had some of the same pet names for him that I thought were unique to us. The second woman was a nurse who worked nights at a hospital downtown. Her engagement photos were taken at the same park where we'd had ours, and she was wearing a ring that was clearly from the same jeweler. She posted about their relationship with such genuine happiness that it broke my heart. She talked about how he'd surprised her with romantic gestures, brought her flowers after long shifts, and how she'd never felt so loved in her life. The third woman was the hardest to find because she kept her social media more private, but when I finally located her, I realized why. She was from his hometown, about 3 hours away, and from what I could tell, she'd been the first one. Her engagement announcement was dated over a year ago, and her post suggested they'd been together for at least 3 years. She talked about him like he was her high school sweetheart, her first love, the person she'd always assumed she'd marry. Looking at all their profiles, I started to see the pattern of his manipulation. He'd crafted slightly different versions of himself for each of us. With me, he was the ambitious businessman who valued intelligence and independence. With the teacher, he was the family-oriented man who wanted kids and a quiet suburban life. With the nurse, he was the understanding partner who supported her demanding career. With the hometown girl, he was the loyal boyfriend who'd never forgotten where he came from. Each relationship was built on the foundation of telling us exactly what we wanted to hear. He'd somehow figured out our deepest desires and insecurities, then molded himself into the perfect man to address them. The scariest part was how genuine it had all felt. I still couldn't reconcile the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who seemed to know me better than I knew myself, with the calculating predator I was uncovering. The logistics of maintaining 4 separate relationships started to make sense as I pieced together his methods. His work required a lot of travel, or so he'd told each of us. Now I realized those business trips were actually visits to his other fiancés. The nights he said he was working late were evenings spent with them. The weekend conferences he attended were romantic getaways with other women. He'd been incredibly careful about keeping us separated. We lived in different areas, worked in different industries, and moved in completely different social circles. He'd even made sure we had different favorite restaurants, different regular hangout spots, and different friend groups. The level of planning and deception required to pull this off was staggering. I also discovered that each of us was planning our wedding for a different season. The hometown girl was planning hers for the spring, the teacher for the summer, the nurse for the fall, and mine was scheduled for winter. I couldn't tell if this was intentional on his part or just a coincidence, but it meant he had almost a full year to figure out how to handle the situation. The financial aspect of his deception was equally disturbing. For engagement rings, multiple apartments or houses he was supposedly paying for as investments, constant travel expenses, and lavish gifts for all of us. Either he was making significantly more money than any of us realized, or he was financing this elaborate scheme through debt or other means that would eventually catch up with him. As I sat with all this information, I felt a mix of rage, betrayal, and oddly relief. The relief surprised me, but I realized it came from finally understanding why certain things had never quite felt right. The occasional inconsistencies in his stories, the times when he seemed to forget conversations we'd had, the way he sometimes called me by a name that wasn't quite mine but was close enough that I thought I'd misheard him. I knew I had to do something with this information, but I wasn't sure what. Confronting him felt pointless. He was clearly a master manipulator who would probably just lie his way out of it, or turn it around on me somehow. I thought about just disappearing from his life, but that would leave the other women still trapped in his web of lies. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the other women deserved to know the truth. They were living the same lie I was, planning futures with a man who was never going to be able to deliver on his promises. But I also knew that approaching them directly would be incredibly difficult. How do you tell someone that their entire relationship is built on deception? How do you destroy someone's happiness, even when you know it's based on lies? Update 2. I decided that the other women needed to know the truth, but I struggled with how to approach them. I couldn't just send them a message on social media. That would seem like I was some crazy ex-girlfriend trying to cause trouble. I needed proof, and I needed a way to present the information that would be believable rather than seeming like an attack on their relationships. I started by creating a fake email account and spending hours crafting a message that would get their attention without immediately seeming like spam or harassment. I included specific details that only someone who actually knew him would know, details about his habits, his preferences, and his behavior patterns that he'd shared with all of us. I also included photos from the jewelry store receipts and screenshots from his social media accounts that showed inconsistencies in his stories. The first response came from the nurse. She wrote back within hours, and I could feel the confusion and panic in her message. She said she'd noticed some things that hadn't made sense but had dismissed them because she trusted him completely. She wanted to know more, and she wanted to meet in person. The teacher took 2 days to respond, and her message was much more skeptical. She accused me of trying to sabotage her relationship and said she was going to show my email to her fiancé. I was terrified that she would warn him before I could reach the other women, but I decided to trust that once she really looked at the evidence, she would start to see the truth. The hometown girl never responded to my first email, so I tried a different approach. I found her address through public records and sent her a letter with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. I included a note explaining that I wasn't trying to hurt her, but that I thought she deserved to know what was really happening. While I waited for responses, I continued gathering more evidence. I started following him more carefully, taking photos when I saw him with the other women, documenting his lies about where he was going and what he was doing. I felt like I was living a double life, pretending everything was normal while secretly building a case against the man I was supposed to marry in less than a month. The breakthrough came when the nurse agreed to meet me at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. I was nervous about the meeting, afraid she would think I was crazy or desperate, but I knew I had to try. When I saw her walk in, I was struck by how similar we looked. Not identical, but we both had the same general build, the same hair color, and the same style of dressing. It was like he had a type, which made his deception feel even more calculated. She sat down across from me and immediately said she'd been doing her own investigation since receiving my email. She'd found discrepancies in his stories, unexplained absences, and financial records that didn't add up. She'd also discovered that some of the romantic gestures he'd made for her, special songs, unique date ideas, even specific phrases he used, were things she'd seen posted on social media by other women in relationships. We spent 3 hours comparing notes, and the picture that emerged was of a man who was not just cheating, but who was living multiple completely fabricated lives. He'd told her his parents were dead, but he told me they were estranged. He'd said he was an only child to the teacher, but claimed to have 2 sisters to me. He'd even given different explanations for scars on his body and had different favorite foods and hobbies depending on which woman he was with. The nurse and I decided to work together to contact the other women. She reached out to the teacher, using a more personal approach since they were both in helping professions. I tried again to contact the hometown girl, this time through a mutual acquaintance I'd identified on social media. The teacher was the hardest to convince, but eventually the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. She admitted that she'd been having doubts but had dismissed them because she was so invested in the relationship. She'd already sent wedding invitations and had been planning to quit her job to move closer to him after the wedding. The hometown girl finally responded through the mutual acquaintance, and her message was heartbreaking. She said she'd suspected something was wrong for months but had been afraid to investigate because she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. She'd been with him the longest and had built her entire adult life around their relationship. Once all 4 of us were in contact, we decided to meet in person. We chose a location that was central to all of us and spent an entire Saturday piecing together the full scope of his deception. The level of detail and planning he'd put into maintaining 4 separate relationships was staggering. He'd kept detailed notes about each of us, had different phones for different relationships, and had even created false social media accounts to support his various personas. We discovered that he'd been borrowing money from each of us under different pretenses. He told me he needed a loan for a business investment, the teacher that he was helping his sick mother with medical bills, the nurse that he was paying off student loans, and the hometown girl that he was saving for a house for their future together. In total, he'd taken almost $60,000 from the 4 of us combined. The financial deception was bad enough, but the emotional manipulation was worse. Each of us had made major life decisions based on our relationship with him. I turned down a job opportunity in another state because I didn't want to do long distance. The teacher had been planning to leave her job and move. The nurse had been saving for a house and had already put down deposits on wedding vendors. The hometown girl had been supporting him financially while he supposedly built his business. As we sat there sharing our stories, I was amazed by how similar our experiences had been, yet how different his approach had been with each of us. He'd identified what each of us needed most: security, adventure, understanding, or stability, and had positioned himself as the perfect provider of those things. He'd studied us like a psychologist studies patients, learning exactly which buttons to push to keep us invested in the relationship. We also realized that his behavior had been escalating over time. The hometown girl reported that he'd been increasingly controlling and possessive, monitoring her communications and isolating her from friends and family. The teacher said he'd been pressuring her to make bigger and bigger sacrifices for their relationship. The nurse had noticed that he'd become more demanding of her time and attention, even when she was working difficult shifts. The 4 of us made a pact that day. We would confront him together, but not in a way that would give him the opportunity to manipulate or gaslight us individually. We would also make sure that other women were warned about him, and we would work together to recover the money he'd stolen from us. Final update. We spent 2 weeks planning our confrontation, and during that time, we uncovered even more disturbing information about him. The hometown girl found evidence that he'd been engaged to at least one other woman before us, someone who had apparently discovered his deception and left town abruptly about 3 years ago. We also found out that he'd been using variations of the same fake business story with multiple women over the years, always claiming to be on the verge of a big breakthrough that would make him wealthy. The most shocking discovery came when the nurse used her connections at the hospital to run a background check on him. His name, social security number, and address all checked out, but there were gaps in his employment history and education that didn't match what he'd told any of us. It appeared that he'd been living this pattern of deception for much longer than we'd realized, possibly for most of his adult life. We decided to confront him at his apartment on a Saturday afternoon when he thought he was meeting me for lunch. The other 3 women were hiding in my car in the parking garage, and we'd arranged for them to come up to the apartment 10 minutes after I arrived. I told him I had something important to discuss about our wedding plans, which wasn't technically a lie. When I walked into his apartment, he was in full charming mode, talking about how excited he was for our upcoming wedding and how much he loved me. Hearing those words, knowing what I knew, made me feel sick. I managed to keep up the pretense for about 5 minutes before the other women arrived. The look on his face when the nurse walked through the door was something I'll never forget. Pure panic, followed immediately by confusion, then a rapid calculation as he tried to figure out how to handle the situation. When the teacher and hometown girl appeared behind her, he actually went pale and sat down heavily on his couch. For a moment, he tried to bluff his way out of it. He claimed that we were all crazy, that we were stalking him, that we were trying to ruin his life out of jealousy. But when we started presenting the evidence, the jewelry store receipts, the photos, the financial records, the timeline of his lies, he realized that denial wasn't going to work. His next strategy was to try to divide us by claiming that his relationships with 3 of us weren't real, that he'd only been serious about one of us. He actually tried to manipulate us even in that moment, telling each of us privately that we were the one he truly loved while the others were just mistakes or misunderstandings. The fact that he was still trying to run his con even as it was falling apart around him was both impressive and terrifying. When manipulation didn't work, he became angry. He accused us of violating his privacy, of conspiring against him, of being unable to understand the complexity of his situation. He claimed that he'd been trying to figure out how to handle the situation, that he'd been planning to come clean with everyone, that he'd never meant for things to get so complicated. The hometown girl who had been with him the longest was the one who finally shut him down. She stood up and told him that she'd wasted 4 years of her life on him, that she'd given up opportunities in relationships because she believed in their future together. She said that the worst part wasn't even the cheating, it was the fact that nothing about their relationship had been real. He'd been performing a character for her entire adult life. We prepared for this confrontation legally as well as emotionally. We had copies of all the financial records showing the money he'd borrowed from each of us, and we'd already consulted with the lawyer about our options for recovering those funds. We presented him with a written agreement. He would pay back every penny he'd taken from us within 6 months, or we would pursue legal action for fraud. He tried to claim that the money had been gifts, not loans, but we had text messages and emails where he'd explicitly promised to pay us back. The lawyer had told us that while proving fraud might be difficult, we had a strong case for breach of contract at minimum. The strangest part of the whole confrontation was how quickly his entire persona crumbled once he realized the game was over. The charming, confident man I'd fallen in love with disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed smaller, more desperate, and ultimately more pathetic than threatening. It was like watching an actor break character, except this actor had been performing for years. After we left his apartment, the 4 of us went to dinner together. It was surreal, sitting around a table with 3 women who'd been living parallel versions of my life, but it was also oddly healing. We talked about the warning signs we'd missed, the red flags we'd dismissed, and the ways his manipulation had worked on each of us. The teacher said she'd always been told she was too trusting, too naive, but now she realized that wasn't a character flaw, it was just normal human behavior to trust someone who claimed to love you. The nurse talked about how she'd always prided herself on being a good judge of character, and how shaken she was to realize she'd been so completely deceived. The hometown girl said she felt like she was grieving not just the relationship, but the entire version of herself that had existed within it. Over the following months, we stayed in touch and supported each other through the process of rebuilding our lives. The nurse was the first to start dating again, and she met someone wonderful who was nothing like him. Someone who was completely transparent about his life and his past relationships. The teacher decided to take a year off from dating to focus on her career and ended up getting a promotion that she'd been too afraid to pursue while she was planning her wedding. The hometown girl had the hardest time recovering, since she'd been with him the longest and had built her entire adult identity around their relationship. She ended up moving to a different city for a fresh start and later told us it was the best decision she'd ever made. As for me, I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I'd always thought of myself as someone who needed a relationship to feel complete, but going through this experience taught me that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I also learned to trust my instincts more. Looking back, I could see that there had been warning signs I'd ignored because I wanted so badly to believe in the fairy tale. We never did get all our money back. He made a few payments initially but then disappeared entirely. We found out later that he'd left town and was apparently running the same scam in a different state. We reported him to the police, but without evidence of criminal intent, there wasn't much they could do. The experience changed all of us, but not in the way you might expect. Yes, we were more cautious about trusting people, but we were also more confident in our ability to survive betrayal and deception. We'd face one of the worst things that could happen in a relationship and come out stronger on the other side. I sometimes wonder about the other women he's probably deceiving right now, and I hope they have friends who will notice the inconsistencies in his stories or the courage to investigate when something doesn't feel right. I also hope that someday his pattern of behavior will catch up with him in a way that prevents him from hurting anyone else. The most important thing I learned from this experience is that real love doesn't require you to ignore your instincts or dismiss your concerns. Real love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller or to give up important parts of your life. Real love is built on truth, even when that truth is complicated or difficult. Looking back now, I'm grateful that I found out the truth before I married him, even though the discovery was devastating at the time. I'm grateful for the 3 other women who went through this with me, and I'm grateful for the strength I found within myself when I needed it most. Most of all, I'm grateful that I learned these lessons while I still had time to build a better life based on honesty and self-respect rather than elaborate deceptions and false promises.